in which an electrical signal transfers itself down the axon in a neuron and relays a message. A neuron is the nerve cell that transmits electrical messages around the nervous system. There are 3 types of neurons. There is a sensory neuron, which can also be known as an afferent neuron. This connects a receptor to either an interneuron or the central nervous system. Here we have our receptor, so for example it might be a pain receptor in the skin. It relays this message all the way down to the terminals, which is where the synapse can relay that message either to the central nervous system or to another neuron. There is also an interneuron or a connector neuron. This neuron picks up a message from either a sensory neuron and takes it to the central nervous system, or between one neuron to another neuron. The third type of neuron is a motor neuron. It can also be known as an efferent neuron, and this is a neuron that goes from the central nervous system or from an interneuron to an effector. So you've got here the dendrites that pick up the message from the previous neuron or the central nervous system and takes it to an effector. Now an effector can be either a muscle or a gland, and this is where we actually get a response. So for example, the gland might release a hormone or the muscle fibre might contract. This is the basic structure of a neuron. So you have the dendrites here that receive the message in the first place. You have the cell body, which contains the nucleus. You have the axon, which is where the action potential or the electrical signal passes through. And then you have the terminals, which is where the synapse is that creates a new action potential in the following neuron, effector, or central nervous system. Because we are looking at an action potential, and an action potential takes place in the axon, this is now what we're going to be looking at. If you zoomed in to the membrane of an axon, it would look something like this. So you have the extracellular fluid on the outside of the membrane, you have the intracellular fluid, which represents a cytosol of that particular cell. You have a carrier protein embedded in the membrane, and you have your phosphate heads and your lipid tails to make up your phospholipid bilayer. When a membrane in an axon is resting, it's termed polarized. Polarized actually means that there is a difference in charge from outside compared to inside the membrane. An axon that is at rest or not transmitting an impulse is more negative inside in comparison to outside. Now that's not saying that inside's negative and outside's positive, it's just saying that outside's more positive and inside's more negative, so it's a comparison. The way in which we can get this change of charge is due to the sodium-potassium pump, and this is a really key example of active transport. So with the use of energy, this carrier protein pumps 3 sodium ions against its concentration gradient, and at the same time pumps 2 potassium ions into the cell against a concentration gradient. So as the carrier protein pushes 3 sodium ions out of the membrane and pushes 2 potassium ions into the membrane, it creates a difference in charge. Now you should notice that both sodium and potassium are both positive. However, having 3 positive ions on one side compared to 2 positive ions on the other makes the side with the 3 ions slightly more positive. Therefore, the extracellular component of or outside the membrane is more positive than the component inside the membrane. Now the other way in which the inside of the membrane can become more negative is because there's actually chlorine ions located within the cytoplasm. And this is a really essential process that needs to occur and requires active transport. So this is what's occurring in the membrane of the axon when the membrane or the neuron is resting. So there is no message being transferred at this stage. And in this diagram of the sodium-potassium pump, you can see this carrier molecule pumping 3 sodium ions out and pumping 2 potassium ions in each time. It needs ATP, which obviously once it's been used becomes ADP. And then we have a slightly more negative area inside and a slightly more positive area outside of that membrane. So we've discussed the membrane being polarized or resting, but the membrane can also become active or depolarized, and this is known as an action potential. So when an action potential or a message, a chemical message, is picked up by the dendrites and transfers itself through the axon, there is a change that occurs in the membrane. The first and most significant change is that all of a sudden the membrane becomes permeable to sodium, which means that all of a sudden the sodium moves into the cell. Therefore, with the influx of positive sodium ions moving into the cell, we have a change in the charge. So all of a sudden the inside of the cell becomes more positive and the outside of the cell becomes more negative. So it's depolarized. We have a change in the charge that the sodium-potassium pump has been originally trying to maintain. So if we have a look here at this basic picture of a neuron, we have the resting potential, some more sodium ions outside, more potassium ions inside. We have positive environment outside and a negative environment inside. And when that action potential hits or that message is being transferred, sodium is able to move in, therefore it becomes more positive inside and negative outside. We have a change in charge. The resting potential is known as polarization, and the action potential is known as depolarization. When a nerve impulse is carried out along the neuron, we can actually see it in the form of a diagram. So if, for example, you have electrical receptors hooked up to a neuron connecting to a muscle cell, you can actually see the way in which the action potential moves along the neuron. And it looks something like this. This represents not only the action potential, but the resting state of the membrane when it gets a stimulus, and the way in which it has to recreate that resting state after an action potential has occurred. So you can see the resting state of the membrane, or the polarized membrane here. It looks really, really stable. So on the inside of that membrane it will be slightly negative, and on the outside it will be more positive. So this is what our membrane does majority of the time while it's waiting for an action potential. Now here you can see something that says threshold. Threshold is a place in which a stimulus must reach in order for a nerve impulse to be sent, or for an action potential to be sent. So for example, if we look at the stimulus could be something like stubbing your toe. So when that threshold has been reached, the membrane becomes more permeable to sodium. Sodium moves in, therefore changing the charge from positive on the outside to now positive on the inside, and we create an action potential. Now once that action potential's been created, it's quite quick. Obviously you know how quickly you feel pain when you stub your toe. Once that action potential has moved through the neuron, we need to start to recreate that resting state. So this is where repolarization occurs. Repolarization is where sodium ions get pumped back out of the membrane and potassium ions start to move back in to create the state in which the cell membrane likes to be at during rest. Now, we were talking about this with regard to homeostasis. Often, your body overcompensates and you get too many sodium ions moving out and too many potassium ions moving in. Same thing we saw with exercise. When we were exercising a lot, our body overcompensated with the heat that we were feeling, and we either sweated too much or we lost a lot of heat, and your body actually was below the temperature you should be, and so it took a little bit of time to recover from that overshoot. Same thing happens here. So we recover from the overshoot of the sodium-potassium pump, which now begins to come back to a normal state at the rest. But while it is overcoming that overshoot, it's known as the refractory period. During the refractory period, no new action potentials can be produced. Therefore, no new messages can occur. When it gets back up to the resting state, with the positive sodiums on one side and the negative inside due to less potassium and chlorine, then a new action potential can be produced. So this is the way in which an electrical signal moves across the axon to generate a nerve impulse.